Samuel pulled his coat tighter around himself as the cold autumn rain soaked the city streets. His shoes squished with each step, the water seeping through the worn soles, but Samuel barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of a life long gone. He found himself drifting into a familiar alley, a narrow path between two tall, shadowed buildings. The alley provided a brief respite from the downpour, but it did nothing to quiet the storm inside him. As he moved deeper into the shadows, something caught his eye. A boy no older than 6 or 7 was standing near the edge of the street, his small figure barely visible under a drenched hoodie. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as he noticed the boy inching closer to the road, completely unaware of the danger looming. A loud screeching sound filled the air, a car speeding around the corner. Samuel reacted without thinking, his body moving faster than his mind could comprehend. He lunged forward, grabbing the boy by the arm just as the car came barreling through. The rush of wind and the roar of the engine drowned out the sound of Samuel's body hitting the ground, his arms still tightly wrapped around the child. For a moment, there was only silence. The car sped away, oblivious to the near disaster it had almost caused. Samuel slowly sat up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The boy was safe, still clutched in his grasp, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. You saved me," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Samuel nodded, gently releasing his grip. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt foreign in his mouth. He stood up quickly, brushing the dirt from his clothes, and without a second glance, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of streets and alleyways before anyone could ask him more. The boy watched as the man vanished, his small body still shaking from the shock of the moment. He didn't know the man's name, but something about him lingered in his thoughts. Something familiar, yet distant. Later that night, in a sprawling mansion on the other side of town, Ethan sat in silence, replaying the incident in his mind. His father, Richard, a well-known politician, paced the room, furious at the near miss. "What were you doing out there alone, Ethan?" Richard demanded, his voice stern but laced with concern. Ethan looked down at his feet, unsure of how to explain. "I just wanted to explore. I didn't mean to go so far." Richard sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "You could have been killed," he muttered, though his thoughts were elsewhere now. "Who was the man that saved you?" "I don't know," Ethan replied quietly. He didn't say anything. He just left. Richard's brow furrowed. A nameless man saving his son, then disappearing without a word? It didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the image of this unknown savior, someone who had intervened at a critical moment and yet wanted no recognition. The idea nagged at Richard, who was used to people seeking praise for even the smallest deeds. The next morning, Richard was already on the phone with his staff, giving instructions to find the man who had saved his son. He needed to know more. Was this person dangerous? Why had he been in that alley? A part of Richard wanted to ensure his family's safety, but there was something else, a deep-rooted sense of gratitude that gnawed at him. As the days passed, Richard's team combed through the city, looking for anyone who might have seen the incident. They followed every lead, checking local shelters and soup kitchens, but no one knew anything about the mysterious man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Richard's frustration grew. His usual methods of gathering information, political connections, private investigators, were failing him. The man was a ghost, leaving no trace. Still, Richard refused to give up. This man had saved his son's life, and Richard wasn't the kind of man to leave debts unpaid. He needed to find him, not just for the sake of thanking him, but for something deeper, something that he couldn't yet explain. Samuel wandered through the city streets, trying to shake off the events of the night. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, gratitude, fear, and above all, a deep-rooted sense of loneliness. It wasn't the first time he had saved someone, but it was the first time it had meant something. The boy's wide, innocent eyes haunted him, making him recall a different time, a time before his life had unraveled. Once, Samuel had been known for his art. He had painted canvases that stirred emotion, that made people stop and think. His pieces were displayed in galleries, and his name was whispered with admiration in artistic circles. But that was before the accident that took his wife, before the grief that consumed him, before he lost everything. As he passed a street corner, his eyes were drawn to an old, faded mural on a crumbling brick wall. He had painted it years ago, back when he still believed his art could change the world. The colors had dimmed with time, the once vibrant strokes now dull and forgotten, much like him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the mural, the memories flooding back. His wife, Miriam, had been his muse, his greatest support. She had believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Losing her had broken him in ways he never thought possible. He had tried to keep painting, tried to hold on to the life they had built together, but it all felt meaningless without her. Slowly, the art world moved on without him, and Samuel drifted, becoming just another lost soul in the city. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts that life was gone, and he had long since accepted it. Now, he existed in the shadows, unseen and unnoticed, just as he preferred. But something about that boy, about saving him, had stirred something inside Samuel, a faint glimmer of purpose, something he hadn't felt in years. He turned away from the mural and continued walking, blending into the background of the city, just as he had always done. Meanwhile, Richard's frustration was growing. Days had passed since his team began their search for the man who had saved Ethan, and they had nothing. No name, no background, no leads. Every avenue seemed to turn up empty, and Richard's patience was wearing thin. Then, one evening, as he sat in his office reviewing documents, one of his aides burst in with a small glimmer of hope. "Sir, we might have found something," the aide said, slightly out of breath. Richard looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Go on. There's a witness. A man who works at a diner near the alley where the incident happened. He says he saw a man matching the description you gave, someone who looked homeless, just before the accident. He couldn't provide much detail, but he said the man is often seen around that area." Richard's interest peaked. It wasn't much, but it was the first lead they'd had. "Get more information," he instructed. "I want to know everything about that area. Who frequents it, what happens there. We're not stopping until we find him." The aide nodded and hurried out of the office, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the puzzle of this mysterious man. Who was he? And why did he disappear so quickly after saving Ethan? Richard couldn't let go. There was something more to this man, something that Richard felt compelled to understand. He wasn't just looking for closure. He was looking for answers, the kind that couldn't be found in public speeches or political handshakes. The next day, Richard's team returned with more information. The area around the alley was a gathering place for many of the city's homeless population. They had spoken to several people, most of whom didn't know anything useful. But one man had mentioned seeing a mural on a nearby wall, an old painting that had once been famous. According to him, the artist who painted it used to live in the area, though no one had seen him in years. It was a strange lead, but it was all they had. Richard decided to pursue it. If this man had once been an artist, maybe he could be found through his work. Maybe, just maybe, this mural would lead them to the person they were searching for. While Richard's search for the mysterious man deepened, Ethan found himself thinking more and more about the night of the accident. His father's worry had faded into routine political business, but for Ethan, the incident had left a lasting impression. He couldn't stop wondering about the man who saved him. Who was he? Why did he leave without saying anything? At school, Ethan tried to distract himself with his studies and friends, but his thoughts always drifted back to the same moment. The image of the man's face, shadowed in the dim light of the alley, played over and over in his mind. There was something kind, yet sad, about the way he had looked at Ethan before disappearing. It didn't make sense to him. Why would someone save a life and then just walk away? One afternoon, after school, Ethan decided to act on his curiosity. He had overheard his father talking to his staff about the search for the man, and he knew the general area where it had happened. He was forbidden from going back there, but the pull to find answers was too strong. Ethan convinced his nanny to take him for a walk, subtly guiding her toward the alley where the accident had occurred. As they neared the area, Ethan felt a nervous excitement bubbling inside him. He scanned the streets, hoping for any sign of the man. His nanny, distracted by her phone, didn't notice when he slipped away, darting into the alley on his own. The alley was quiet, the rain from the previous night leaving puddles in its wake. Ethan walked slowly, his heart pounding in his chest as he retraced his steps. He reached the spot where it had all happened, crouching down as if he could somehow feel the presence of the man who had saved him. But there was no one there. The alley was empty, and the mystery remained unsolved. Ethan sighed, disappointed. But as he stood up, something caught his eye. There, at the end of the alley, was an old brick wall covered in a faded mural. It was beautiful, even in its worn state, and something about it drew Ethan closer. The mural seemed out of place in such a dreary part of town. As Ethan studied it, he felt a strange connection to the artist who had painted it. Was this the work of the man who would save him? He had no way of knowing, but the thought lingered in his mind. He heard his nanny's voice calling for him, and reluctantly, Ethan turned and ran back to her. But as they left the alley, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mural was a clue, maybe even a connection to the man he was so determined to find. On the other side of town, Samuel stood in front of another one of his murals, this one tucked away in an abandoned lot. The colors had faded, just like the others, but the passion behind it remained. It had been years since he had painted anything new. In fact, Samuel had tried to forget his artistic past altogether. But lately, the urge to create had started to creep back into his thoughts. The boy he had saved haunted his mind. There was something about that moment, about pulling the boy back from the edge of danger, that had awakened something long buried inside Samuel. For so long, he had lived in the shadows, convinced that his life no longer had any purpose. But saving that boy, it had stirred something he thought he had lost forever. As Samuel walked through the empty lot, his thoughts were interrupted by a group of teenagers who had wandered in, their loud voices breaking the silence. He stayed hidden, watching them as they stared at his mural, laughing and making jokes about the faded artwork. Whoever did this must have been real desperate for attention, one of them said with a sneer. Samuel's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. It didn't matter what they thought. His art had never been about getting attention. It had been about expression, about capturing something real. But as he watched them walk away, a small spark of determination ignited within him. Maybe it was time to paint again, not for recognition, but for himself. He had spent too long hiding from the world, too long burying his talent along with the grief he carried. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to come out of the shadows. Richard stood in the heart of the city, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who passed by. He had taken to visiting shelters and soup kitchens more often, immersing himself in the parts of the city he had once ignored. These visits weren't for publicity. He kept them off the radar of his staff and the media. Richard was searching, not only for the man who saved his son, but for something else. Something he couldn't quite name yet. He had always prided himself on being a man of the people, a politician who understood the needs of his constituents. But now, standing amid those who had been left behind by society, he realized just how distant he had become from the real struggles of the city. The world of politics, with its endless speeches and promises, felt like a farce compared to the raw need he saw here. As he walked past a group of men huddled near a fire, Richard overheard snippets of conversation. Many of them spoke about how hard it was to find work, how easy it was to be forgotten. He saw the looks in their eyes that had given up hope long ago. Yet, in those same eyes, there was something that reminded him of the man he was searching for, Samuel. These men weren't criminals or lazy drifters. They were just people who had fallen through the cracks, just like the man who had saved Ethan. Richard approached one of the men, offering him a warm smile. "I'm looking for someone. A man who saved my son a few weeks ago," he began, choosing his words carefully. "He's homeless, like you. Tall, a bit older. Do you know him?" The man, whose name was Harold, looked Richard up and down, sizing him up. "What's a rich man Like you want with one of us?" Harold asked, his voice hoarse. Richard hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain what he wanted, how to explain the gnawing need to find Samuel. "He saved my son's life. I owe him my thanks," Richard said finally, though even as he said it, he knew it was only part of the truth. Harold studied Richard for a moment before nodding. "I think I've seen him. Old Samuel, right? He keeps to himself, doesn't talk much, but he's around." Richard's heart skipped a beat. Finally, he was close. "Where can I find him?" Harold shrugged. "He comes and goes. You might find him down by the old mural near the river. He spends a lot of time there." Richard thanked Harold and walked away, his mind racing. He was getting closer, but now that he wasn't sure what he would say. How do you thank a man who doesn't want to be found? That evening, Richard returned home, but his mind was still on Samuel. He couldn't stop thinking about the mural Harold had mentioned. Could Samuel really be the artist behind it? The idea seemed strange, almost impossible, but the more Richard thought about it, the more it made sense. After putting Ethan to bed, Richard made his way to his home office and began to search. He pulled up old articles, scanning through them quickly. There it was, an article from over a decade ago, praising a rising artist named Samuel Hill. The article detailed his work in the city, particularly his large murals that had once been a symbol of hope and creativity. But there was no follow-up, no mention of Samuel after that. It was as if he had disappeared, just as his art had faded from the city streets. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the computer screen. He had attended one of Samuel's exhibitions years ago, back when Samuel was still making a name for himself. Richard remembered the event well, an art gala where he had mingled with the city's elite, admiring the talent on display, but never truly connecting with it. At the time, Samuel had been just another artist to him, someone whose talent was respected, but whose life was invisible. Now, the pieces were coming together. Samuel wasn't just a man who had saved his son. He was a man who had once been celebrated, a man who had fallen from grace. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what was visible on the surface. The next morning, Richard made his way to the mural near the river. It was easy to find, faded and worn, but still a striking piece of art. As Richard stood before it, he was struck by the power of the image. It was haunting, yet beautiful, much like the man who had created it. Just as he was about to leave, a figure appeared from the shadows. Samuel stood at the edge of the alley, watching Richard with guarded eyes. "You found me," Samuel said quietly. Richard turned to face him, unsure of how to begin. "I had to. You saved my son's life." Samuel shrugged. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know," Richard replied, "but this isn't just about thanks. I need to understand. Why did you disappear? Why did you walk away?" For a moment, Samuel said nothing. His eyes scanned the mural, as if the answer was hidden somewhere in the faded paint. "Because I don't belong in your world anymore," Samuel said finally, his voice filled with quiet resignation. Richard frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Samuel met his gaze, his eyes filled with pain and weariness. "You wouldn't understand," he said softly. "You live in a world where people like me don't exist." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips. He knew Samuel was right. He had spent so long in the world of power and wealth that he had forgotten about the people who lived in the shadows. And now, standing before Samuel, he realized just how much he still didn't understand. Richard stood before Samuel, feeling the weight of his words. There was a long silence between them, one that echoed with unspoken truths. Samuel turned his gaze back to the mural, his body stiff, as if he was preparing himself for another round of rejection. Rejection from a world that had forgotten him, from people like Richard who rarely saw past their own circles. "I don't think you understand," Richard said quietly, trying to bridge the chasm that stretched between them. "This isn't just about a simple thank you. You saved my son. You gave me back the most important person in my life." Samuel's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, but there was no joy in it. "I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't even think about it. I saw a kid in danger, and I acted. That's all." "But that's not all," Richard pressed. You saved his life, and now you're living out here like this. It doesn't have to be this way. Samuel tensed at the words, his hands balling into fists. What do you know about how it has to be? You think just because you have money, because you live in some fancy house, that you can fix everything. Richard paused, taken aback by the anger in Samuel's voice. I'm not trying to fix you, he said, more softly now. I just want to help. Samuel shook his head, stepping back, distancing himself from Richard. You can't help me. You can't undo what's already been done. There's no going back to the way things were. Not for me. Richard struggled to find the right words. He wanted to explain, to make Samuel see that there was still hope, still a way out of the darkness. But Samuel's expression was hardened, set in a way that spoke of deep pain and resignation. This was a man who had already given up on the idea of being saved. I don't need your pity, Samuel muttered, turning his back on Richard. You can't save me, so go back to your world and leave me in mine. With that, Samuel walked away, disappearing into the labyrinth of alleyways and streets like a ghost. Richard stood there for a long time, staring at the mural, feeling as though he had failed. He had wanted to give something back to the man who had saved his son's life, but now it seemed that Samuel wanted nothing to do with him. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain through the air. Richard shoved his hands in his pockets, feeling more helpless than he had in years. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do. He didn't have the right words, didn't have the answers. All he had was the overwhelming sense that something was wrong, something bigger than just the distance between him and Samuel. But Samuel had made it clear. He didn't want help, and Richard had no idea how to change that. Days passed, and Richard couldn't stop thinking about Samuel. The encounter had left him feeling unsettled, like a puzzle with missing pieces. It wasn't just about the fact that Samuel had refused his help. It was about what that refusal represented. Samuel was right in a way. Richard's life had been built on the idea that money and power could solve problems. But what if there were problems that those things couldn't fix? At home, Richard found himself distant from his usual routines. He attended meetings, spoke at political events, but his mind was elsewhere. Even Ethan noticed, asking his father why he seemed so distracted. Richard didn't have a good answer. How could he explain to his son that the man who saved his life didn't want to be found, didn't want to be helped? One evening, as Richard sat in his office, staring blankly at the papers scattered across his desk, he felt a tug of guilt. The search for Samuel had started as a way to thank the man, but now Richard realized it had turned into something more personal. He wasn't just searching for Samuel anymore. He was searching for answers about himself. Why did it bother him so much that Samuel had rejected his offer? Was it because Richard couldn't stand the idea of someone refusing help from a man like him? Or was it because, deep down, Richard knew that he had been blind to the struggles of people like Samuel for too long? He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as memories from the past few weeks played out in his mind. He had been living in a bubble for so long, surrounded by wealth, influence, and the illusion that he was making a difference. But now, after meeting Samuel, he wasn't so sure anymore. Was he really helping people? Or was he just maintaining a comfortable distance from the harsh realities that so many faced? His thoughts drifted to Ethan. How could he teach his son to be compassionate, to understand the world beyond their privilege, when he had failed to see it himself? The next day, Richard took a different approach. Instead of searching for Samuel in the shadows, he decided to use his position to shed light on the issue. He called a press conference, announcing a new initiative aimed at addressing homelessness in the city. It wasn't just about throwing money at the problem. It was about creating real, lasting change. Richard knew that it wouldn't be easy, and he knew it might cost him politically. But for the first time in a long while, that didn't matter. Later that night, as he sat with Ethan, reading him a bedtime story, Ethan looked up at his father with wide, curious eyes. "Dad, did you ever find the man who saved me?" Richard hesitated, unsure of how to explain everything to his son. "I did find him," he said finally. "But sometimes people don't want to be found, and that's okay." Ethan frowned, confused. But why wouldn't he want to be found? He's a hero. Richard smiled faintly, stroking Ethan's hair. Not all heroes want to be in the spotlight. Some just do the right thing and move on. Ethan seemed to think about this for a moment before nodding slowly. I guess that makes sense. As Richard tucked Ethan in, he couldn't help but think about the man who had saved his son, the man who had walked away without asking for anything in return. Samuel might have refused his help, but that didn't mean Richard was done trying to make things right. Ethan's curiosity didn't wane, even after his father's explanation. The idea that someone could save a life and simply walk away without asking for anything in return intrigued him. In Ethan's young mind, heroes were supposed to be celebrated, but this man, this Samuel, had vanished into the shadows like a ghost. It didn't sit right with him. As the days went by, Ethan found himself thinking more and more about Samuel. He wondered where the man slept, what he ate, and why he seemed so distant from the world. During lunch at school, while his friends talked about their favorite superheroes, Ethan's mind wandered back to that narrow alley, to the moment Samuel pulled him away from the speeding car. Was Samuel homeless? Did he live on the streets? Ethan had overheard his father mention something about it, but he wasn't sure what that meant. One afternoon, while his nanny was distracted, Ethan sneaked into his father's office. He knew that Richard had been searching for Samuel, and he was determined to find something, anything, that could help him learn more about the man who had saved him. Ethan carefully rifled through the papers on his father's desk, scanning reports and notes. He didn't understand most of it, but one word kept appearing: mural. There were mentions of a mural near the river, one that Samuel had painted years ago. Ethan's heart raced with excitement. Maybe if he found the mural, he could find Samuel. That evening, after dinner, Ethan told his nanny he wanted to take a walk near the river. She was hesitant at first, but Ethan pleaded, insisting that he wanted to see the sunset by the water. Finally, she relented, and they set off toward the river. As they approached the area, Ethan's heart pounded with anticipation. He spotted the mural in the distance, its faded colors still vibrant enough to catch his attention. It was beautiful, even in its worn state, and something about it felt familiar, like it had been waiting for him to find it. Ethan stared at the mural in awe. The colors seemed to dance in the evening light, telling a story that he couldn't quite understand, but felt deep in his heart. Was this really Samuel's work? And if so, what happened to him? Why had he stopped painting? Ethan looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of Samuel, but the streets were quiet. There was no sign of the man who had saved him, no sign of anyone who could answer the questions swirling in his mind. Still, as they left the river, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to finding out the truth. While Ethan was on his own quest to understand Samuel, Richard's announcement about his new initiative to address homelessness had begun to take shape. It wasn't just a political move. Richard had thrown his heart into it, determined to create real change, even if it meant facing opposition. And opposition came quickly. Richard's advisors warned him that focusing too much on homelessness could alienate certain wealthy donors and voters who didn't see it as a pressing issue. But Richard didn't care anymore. After meeting Samuel, he couldn't ignore the problem any longer. The plight of the homeless wasn't just a talking point for him now. It was personal. In a press conference held at City Hall, Richard stood before the cameras, his voice steady as he laid out his plan. He spoke about creating affordable housing, increasing funding for shelters, and offering more support for mental health services. He acknowledged the complexity of the issue, but for the first time in his career, he didn't sugarcoat it. This wasn't about making promises for votes. It was about doing what was right. As Richard finished his speech, a reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Gray, why the sudden focus on homelessness? Some say this shift in priorities is politically motivated." Richard met the reporter's gaze, his expression serious. "I met someone recently who opened my eyes to how much I've been missing. Sometimes you don't see a problem until it's staring you in the face. But now that I see it, I can't ignore it." The reporter pressed further. "Can you tell us more about this person?" Richard hesitated, not wanting to reveal Samuel's identity. "No," he said simply. "This isn't about one person. It's about the thousands of people in our city who are struggling, and it's time we did something about it." The press conference ended, and as Richard left the podium, he felt a sense of resolve. He knew he was going to face backlash, but he didn't care. This was a fight worth having, and he was ready to see it through. That night, after the conference, Richard returned home to find Ethan waiting for him in the living room, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Dad," Ethan began, "I went to see the mural today." Richard blinked, surprised. "You did?" Ethan nodded. "It's beautiful. I think Samuel must have been really good at painting." Richard smiled softly. "He was. He is." "Why did he stop?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet. Richard sighed, sitting down next to his son. "Sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan. People go through things that change them, that make them feel like they can't do what they used to love." Ethan looked down at his hands, thinking, "Do you think he'll ever paint again?" Richard hesitated, not sure how to answer. "I don't know," he said finally. "But maybe if he sees that people still care about his work, he might." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind still turning over the things he had seen and heard. "I hope he does," he whispered. As Richard hugged his son goodnight, he couldn't help but wonder if Ethan's quiet hope wasn't just about Samuel's art, but about something bigger. Perhaps through this journey, both he and Ethan were learning that sometimes the best way to help someone was simply to show them that they were still seen. The wind was sharp that morning as Samuel stood in front of the mural by the river, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He stared at the faded colors, the worn lines that once told a story of hope. People used to stop and admire this mural, back when his name still meant something. But now, it was just another piece of forgotten art in a city that moved too fast to notice the details. He had been avoiding this place for years, pretending that he no longer cared. But after the encounter with Richard and hearing that the boy, Ethan, had come to see the mural, something had shifted inside Samuel. He didn't know why, but the thought of that child standing here, staring up at his work, stirred feelings he thought were long dead. The city had changed so much, yet here stood his creation, still clinging to life despite the years of neglect. It felt like a reflection of himself, weathered, cracked, but somehow still standing. Samuel reached out, tracing the outline of a figure he had painted long ago. His fingers brushed against the chipped paint, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the pull of his old life. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe there was still something left in him that could be brought back to life. Samuel didn't make any grand decisions that morning. He didn't declare that he would return to painting or that he would change his life. But as he walked away from the mural, he couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps he wasn't done yet. Maybe there was still more to say, more to express. A few days later, Samuel found himself standing in front of an old, boarded-up building near the river. The walls were grimy and covered in graffiti, but there was a blank canvas of space just waiting for something more. Samuel had walked by this building countless times, always imagining what he could paint there, but never acting on it. Until now, with an old set of paints and brushes he had managed to gather, Samuel stood in front of the wall, the early morning light casting long shadows across the street. His hands shook as he dipped the brush into the paint, but once the brush hit the wall, all the years of rust began to fall away. His strokes were hesitant at first, but soon they grew bolder, more confident. He wasn't just painting an image, he was pouring his heart into the wall, every stroke a release of years of bottled-up emotions. The people passing by stopped to watch, some of them recognizing Samuel from his past work, others simply drawn to the beauty of what was unfolding before them. But Samuel didn't notice them. For the first time in years, he was completely absorbed in his art. As the hours passed, a vibrant mural began to take shape. It wasn't just a painting, it was a message of resilience, of the power to rebuild even when life has knocked you down. It was his story, told through color and shape, and as Samuel stepped back to admire his work, he realized that he wasn't just painting for himself anymore. He was painting for all the people who had been forgotten, for those who lived in the shadows, for those like him who had once believed they had nothing left to offer. Richard had heard rumors about Samuel's return to painting before he saw the mural himself. Word had spread quickly through the city. An old artist had reappeared, creating something extraordinary in the forgotten parts of town. Richard had hoped the rumors were true, but he wasn't prepared for the impact of seeing Samuel's work in person. It was a cool autumn evening when Richard and Ethan made their way to the river, where Samuel had been working on his latest mural. As they turned the corner and the full mural came into view, Richard felt a rush of emotion. The colors, the shapes, the sheer scale of the piece. It was breathtaking. It wasn't just art. It was a story of survival, of redemption. Ethan's eyes were wide as he stared up at the mural, his small hands gripping his father's arm. "It's even better than the other one," he whispered. Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes, it is." They stood there in silence for a long time, just taking it all in. The mural told story, Samuel's story, a story of loss, but also of rebirth. It was clear that Samuel hadn't just returned to painting. He had poured his soul into this piece, and the result was nothing short of extraordinary. As they stood there, a figure appeared from the shadows. Samuel, paint-stained and tired, walked slowly toward them. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside Richard and Ethan, gazing up at the mural in quiet contemplation. "It's beautiful," Richard finally said, his voice soft. Samuel glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "It's not finished yet." Richard smiled. "I don't think it ever will be." Samuel didn't respond, but there was a small flicker of understanding in his eyes. They stood together, the three of them, watching as the last rays of sunlight bathed the mural in a golden glow. In that moment, something had shifted. The divide that once separated Richard and Samuel felt smaller now, as if the mural had bridged the gap between their worlds. There were no grand speeches, no promises of what would come next, but there was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that both men had changed, that both had found something worth holding on to. As night fell, Samuel turned to leave, but this time, he didn't disappear into the shadows. He walked slowly, his step steady, with the knowledge that there was still work to be done, still stories to tell. And Richard, watching him go, knew that this was only the beginning. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future stories. I'd love to hear from you. What part of the story impacted you the most? Was it Samuel's journey of redemption, Richard's realization, or perhaps Ethan's curiosity? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, I'd love to know what kind of stories you'd like to see next on the channel. Do you have a story idea or theme you'd like us to explore? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and who knows, your idea might be the inspiration for our next video.